All right, guys, we're going to start. I'm Noah Pacalny. I'm a second semester app dev member, and I'm going to be teaching you some tips and tricks, and especially debugging in Xcode, just through building a project and just talking about the process. So it's going to be a super simple app. It's just going to be, an app that displays our instructors. There's going to be an image view that's going to be cycling through some images. There's a label, and there's also a background gradient. And this is a 3D reconstruction of what the app's going to look like, and we'll go over how to do this. Okay, so we're just going to jump right into the code. And I'm just going to start laying out. So first things first that we need is just a title. And I'm going to do something that you haven't seen yet, just to keep things kind of stylistically clean. This is what I prefer to do, but this isn't something you need to do. So instead of setting up all of my views in view.load, I'm just going to do closure blocks, anonymous closure blocks at the top, and return that. So this is how you would do that. You just create a label, and then you return it. And so the nice thing you can do here is I can just set all of my properties up. I am recording. And so this will just keep my view did load from getting cluttered. So I'm just going to name it instructors. I'm going to add a font to it, bold system font of 25. I'm going to make it white because I want it to show up on the dark background. And I'm going to align it to the center. And then another nice thing is I'm just going to set my translate masks into constraints to false here. Then I'm just going to add it to the subview title label. This is nothing new. So one thing that I personally like to do, but this is such a minimal optimization, is I'm going to be rewriting the same line basically with like very minimal changes. So one way you could fix this is just by doing a for loop, but it's not really worth that level of thought. So one thing you can do is you do option and drag. You can create multiple cursors, and you can edit multiple lines at the same time. So you can write it. One thing you'll notice, I can't really get to the end of the line here. So you can press option and an arrow, and that will jump to the end or beginning of a word. You can do command, and that will jump to the end of lines. And this is pretty standard across most editors. So if you saw, I copied the constraints, and then I can just do view.safe area layout guide and constrain it. And so just a little simplification there. I'm going to make sure that the background is black so you can see my, my white text. And hopefully that will show up as we want. Not white. Awesome. So now I'm going to add that image view, and I'm going to change it to a different class later, but for now I'll just keep it as a UI image view, and I'm going to do the same thing where I use a closure block. So just UI image view. I have an image. It's called Amy but French. If you remember, I'm going to make it just have these little corners. So to do that again for an image view, you have to set its clips to bound to true. And then image view dot corner radius to 15. And then again, translate to false. And so if you notice, like I am repeating my code a lot. I have to, like, if you imagine if I'm scaling this up to have a lot of views, I'm going to be writing this translate auto resize mask a lot, and I'm going to be adding subview, which is something you could forget, and it just makes you prone to errors. So what I do is I use a for loop just to do it for me. Well, I don't really do a for loop. I do a for each loop, which is really functionally the same. So it's just using a closure. So I'm just going to name my variable subview, and then the view.add subview, and then subview.translate into false. And again, it's a minor thing. You're going to save a few lines of code. So I want my instructor view is going to have a leading, trailing, and then bottom, which is going to be relative to safe area layout guide. So I can again do the same trick with multiple cursors. Except I want to add some padding in. So I'm going to do, I forgot commas, just let padding be a CG float equal to 15. And then I'm actually going to add this here too. And I'm going to change this because I want to show both. I'm not going to use a bottom. I'm just going to use a height. So constant padding. And then title labels height anchor is going to be just 30. And then of course this one's top anchor is going to be title labels bottom anchor with a constant of padding. And then these again need constant of padding, except of course for trailing and bottom I need to make it negative. And that should show up nicely. Okay, awesome. So one thing you'll note is I'm using 15 again here, and we don't really like magic numbers. So ideally what I'd be able to do is add padding in for the corner radius. But when you define your views like this closure is run at the same time as the init function. So essentially you're creating these variables at the same time that you're trying to use them. So it's not going to let you do that. So there's a few ways you can do that, can fix this problem. And one is using a lazy variable, which is a more advanced topic that we can cover another time. But you can also just create a static variable, because then this variable isn't going to be stored in the object, it's going to be stored in the class. So then I just need to reference it differently. So I'll just do that here. And again, using multiple cursors just to kind of speed up the process. And hopefully that will look the same. Okay, awesome. So now I'm going to convert this image view into something that will grab multiple images from the web and pan through them. So I've already written some code for this. And this is kind of scary code, but ultimately what it's doing is when you initialize with some URLs, which are a string. And then on a background thread, it's iterating through these URLs. It's retrieving the URL or the image, storing it in a list. And then it calls this function add animation, which right here, it just adds some animation. It'll fade the image out and in, and then every 10 seconds, actually, it will just increase an index, get the index image, and then if it's too far, it'll wrap around back to 0. So to implement this, since scraping image view is actually a subclass of UI image view, I don't need to change this type. But I do need to change the initializer. So I do scraping image view, initialize with profile URLs, which is just the list of URLs that I have. And in theory, this will work. But as you can see, we get this error, index out of range. And I know a lot of you guys have seen errors like these. And you can read like this thing, which is helpful, but there's so much more going on. So yes, we have your console, fatal error, index out of range. Sometimes this is more helpful than just this. And then over here, you see a bunch of threads, which are honestly really scary. You don't really need to open up anything else that hasn't been opened up already. But what this is just the stack trace of what was called to get here. So I call this timers function with fire, and then this is called by main. So again, not very helpful, but you might see this little variables panel. So this has some local variables I defined within this function that it crashed in. So it has fade out animation, fade in animation, and you can actually expand these variables to see what's going on, except these are like really gross types that don't have great descriptions or anything. So like I have no clue what that means, to be honest. But you can do, like, for some things that are nicer, you can see 10, whatever. And what I didn't check here, but is available here, is this self. And self is a scraping image view. So this is exactly what we want. This is the object that actually caused the error. So you can expand this, and you can see that I actually don't have anything within this images. There's not a single value. So it makes sense that if I'm trying to, index into it, that it's going to crash because there's nothing there. And so a little explanation on concurrency. So some of you guys might have seen this in your classes. Some of you might not. So the top example is something that you would normally think of when you're doing single-threaded programming. So you request an image, you download, it takes forever, you're done. You do the next one, and then you do the same process over and over until you're done with them, and then you can present the image, right? And this is annoying because it's going to take forever, potentially, if you have a lot of images or like really big images to present the image. So you'll have blocked your thread, your main thread, which means your app will be completely unresponsive, your user will get scared, will probably close the app and never open it again. So a fix to this is multi-threading. So you fetch your images on a background thread, and then once you have at least one, then you can start presenting. A better solution would probably be, let's present like a filler image, a placeholder, and then once it fetches it, then you can present one. But it's still, you're going to be multi-threading. So we can see, I did mention that we used a background thread to run it. That's what this global background thread does. It runs this code on a background thread. And this is kind of like, if we think of this as a magical function, we want to know what's being run when. Normally what you do is just add in a bunch of print statements, which is totally valid. You can do that. But something nicer in Xcode and a lot of editors is breakpoints, which are essentially, once a code bit is run, I want to pause execution, and I want to get that same debugger panel that I saw before, so I can check the state of what's going on. So to add a breakpoint, you see these numbers, you can just click, and it creates a new breakpoint. You can drag them around. To delete them, you can just drag them off. You can also turn them off just by clicking on them. So in this process, there's a few important things that I need to understand. When are my images being retrieved? When is it called? When are they returned? So this is the callback, right? So this is going to be called once it's covered. And then when are they going to be used? So an add animation. And so we can see the process in which these functions run using breakpoints. Okay, so the first breakpoint ran. So it's retrieved a single image. You can press play to go continuously until you have another error, or you can just go to the next line with a skip. So I'm going to go to the next error. Okay, so it's another breakpoint at retrieve image. So I've requested to retrieve 2 images, now 3 images, now 4 images. And then the problem is that I'm trying to use these images before they've ever actually been fully downloaded. Right, so that's when I get my error and nothing has happened. So there's a bunch of ways to fix this. What I chose is something called a dispatch semaphore, this is not very important for this lecture, to be honest. But just general concept of what's going on is dispatch semaphore is like a special counter. And so it monitors when you're doing certain things. So dispatch semaphore has a value of the number of images that I'm fetching. And every time I fetch an image here, I increment this counter. So it's going from 0 up. And if it ever hits that value, if it ever hits the number of images, then if it gets called again, it'll block the thread. So essentially what's happening here is I'm calling the semaphore.wait, I'm incrementing it by the number of URLs, and then once this for loop is done, it's coming down here and executing these lines. But this semaphore is at its max. So if it tries to increment it again, it's going to get mad at you until, of course, the semaphore is decremented. So once an image is fully received, then we decrement, and then this will stop blocking, and you run the function. So now that I've uncommented this line, we should have a functioning app. Great. So we have our threading right. Now let's work on the background view. So again, it's just this very simple background gradient. To do that, we need to understand a concept called like frames and layers, which you have already somewhat been introduced to. But here, I'm just going to build this out really quickly. So I need to conform to UI view. I'm going to make a subclass of UI view called gradient view. And all I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be adding this gradient like on top of it, and then I'm going to be stretching the gradient across the entire view. So to create a gradient, we use something called a CA gradient layer. So I'm just going to let layer be a CA gradient layer, turn layer, layer. Okay. So layer takes in a few things, but first and foremost, it's a gradient. It needs some colors. If you want to know the type of something, you can press Option and click on it. So you can see colors. It's an array of CG ref objects. It's a list of any, optional any, which is really scary and was also really annoying when I was designing this lecture, because if you pass in the wrong type, it won't tell you, but it also won't work. So you need to pass in a bunch of CG images, or CG colors, sorry. And every UI color has a CG color, which is just like a conversion. So I can say UI color.red, UI color.green, UI color.blue, and then I'm just going to pass it into a for loop. So like this is map, which is essentially a for loop. So you can do $0.CG image or CG color. And then syntactic sugar for this, if you want to be extra lazy, is just /.CG color. One thing that's really annoying about UI colors is if I want it to be a specific color, if I don't want it to be red or green, I want it to be like a shade of them, I have to use this really long function, which is fine. It's just kind of gross. So there is a solution to this, and it's a little bit worse in the new versions of Xcode. But if you write color literal, it'll do this really nice thing. You have to make sure to do open parentheses and close parentheses, because if you just do open, it eats your code, and then it gets mad at you. So you have to close it. And then it has this little image thing, which will be fixed later. But you can see I was actually supposed to write a lot more in there. I was supposed to write red, green, blue, alpha, but I'm a little lazy because I'm a coder. So to fix this, I can just go in, and I have a color palette now. I'm going to make it dark theme because I really like dark themes. So here's the dark color. And then I'm just going to copy this. And here's another dark color. And then just to distinguish the three, I'm going to again do a dark color and then just make it a little bit brighter. Okay. So now we need two other properties. We need a start point, which is going to be of type CG point. And you can think of the inputs to this as like percents of the width. So if this is like your view, if we're looking at the phone, this is going to be 0% of the width, this is 100% of the width. This is 0% of the height, this is 100% of the height, and then this would be 0% or 100% of the width and 100% of the height. So I'm going to start it from 0, 0, and then I'm going to end it at 50% and 100%. Okay. Now to get a view or a layer to show up, it's pretty similar to adding a view. So I'm just going to call init and frame, and then I have to just add from the layer, add a sublayer, gradient layer. And then I also need to make sure that the gradient layer's frame is equal to the frame of the view, which again, I will explain this in a second, what frames and layers are and how they relate to each other. One extra thing I'm going to do is add an accessibility label. And this will help us both in debugging and is also helpful to people who can't see because it helps them interact with your apps. So I'm going to add a background tag to this. Generally speaking, I feel like you probably shouldn't add a background tag because that's not going to help anyone who's blind because they don't need to know where the background is. But just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to add it. Okay. So now I'm going to add it into my original view. So let background view equal a gradient view. And I'm going to initialize it with a frame. Normally you do this with 0. I'm going to do something else just for example purposes later. And I'm going to add this to the super view. So I'm going to add it first. So I have to put it at the beginning of my list just so it's behind everything else, right? And then I'm going to again do my trick with multi-cursors. I want to top anchor, bottom, leading, and trailing. And I don't care about safe area layout guide here because I want it to actually stretch everywhere. Okay. So if I run this, you'll see our gradient doesn't fit everywhere. And so one way to diagnose this, you could say like, oh, I'm not sure if my background is like, if it's spanning the whole way. And the normal way you'd debug this is the print statement and analog for here is, let's just set the background color to red or whatever, which will work, but it's kind of gross, especially if you have a lot of things going on. So if you click this little button here on the debug panel, debug view hierarchy, you'll get this 3-dimensional reconstruction of your app. And you got a lot of information. On the left, you'll see the different types of views you have. And then here you can get more information that corresponds with this info panel. And actually something cool is you can see your constraints. So I can go into my UI labels constraints, and I can see how it's constrained relative to the view. And if this is kind of scary, like there's a lot going on, you could focus on a specific view and then get just like a hyper-focused view of it. But going back to gradient view, you can see, okay, well, here's our accessibility label. So if we had multiple gradient views, for example, we could see which one's which. But most importantly here, we see that it actually spans the entire like the view matches up with the phone screen. So the issue isn't with the constraints, it's something else, which is the frame. A little review into how frames and constraints work. If we want to constrain our image view with Amy on it to be like the size of the phone, we set a leading, we set a trailing, a top, and a bottom. And then what happens is it will kind of stretch it to fit those constraints, right? And then once that's done, once it's in a stable position, it'll add a frame to it. So a frame has its position, its starting position, its width, and its height. And frames are really important because this is what you give your graphics card to draw the view. So if you don't have this, you're not going to draw anything. And so frames are stored in what's called a layer. So every view has a layer. And then the layer has a lot of properties in it, and one of them is frame. So if you don't use auto layout constraint, but you give it a frame, if you set translate auto resize mask into constraints to be true, then given its frame, it will guess the constraints. Because you've given it a width, you've given it a height, and you've given it a position. So it can guess how it relatively relates to the super view. And of course, the problem, which I'm sure you guys have all run into, is if you accidentally leave this property set to true, and you set your own constraints, things go bad. So angry Amy, right? So you have your constraints that you set in blue, and then the constraints that Xcode set in like lighted green. And you can see there's a conflict here. So the view doesn't really know what to do. And then ultimately what happens is Xcode will just randomly throw out some constraints, because what you've done is you violated a precondition, and Xcode will try to recover, but ultimately it's undocumented behavior. So anything can happen. And so if you have views that are behaving weird, it's probably something like this, and two constraints are conflicting with each other, and so one has been broken. Okay, so some examples. I'm going to be a bad programmer, and instead of putting of adding it to the subview and translate auto resize mask to false, I'm just going to add my background to the super view, and we'll see what happens. So again, it has the same issue, and I got a really nice, really ugly error But what's really important is this unable to satisfy constraints. And so that's what's telling me, okay, I have some constraints that are fighting each other. And so you can like look through here. It's not the prettiest. So I have some constraints. Okay, for gradient view, I only have one gradient view, so I know what's going on. And the width is 321, which is the same as the frame's width. And then if I keep scrolling, I have a height that's the same as the frame's height. So that's essentially what's happening is I've built this frame, and since I forgot to set translate auto resize mask into constraints to false, it's making constraints out of them. So I'm just going to fix that. And why this is at all relevant to what we're doing is because we're building this in the frame. So what happens when you constrain it is your auto layout constraints will update your frame for you. But since we have our own layer, we need to make sure that it's synchronized with the same layer as the views layer. So one way to do that is just every time that the subviews are layouted, because that means that the frame has changed for the super view, we can just change it. So gradient view dot frame equals our layer dot frame. So hopefully this will work. Awesome. So we have a gradient that spans the entire way, and I can prove it to you with this debug page. And I'll focus on it to show you that it is actually a gradient. Awesome. Okay, so now I'm just gonna clean up my code a little bit. So I don't like having layer in here. I can't sadly set it to gradient layer because it'll give me this gross error. Okay, it's not gonna give it to me now, but it will tell you like you can't reference the same thing before it's been defined. But I don't like having layer here because we already have a property layer. So let's say I want to change this variable name. I can right click on it, refactor, rename, and Xcode will find all of the calls to this variable, and I can change it. So I can just say gradient. So, and this will work even if it's across files. So say I want to change this class name, I can right click, refactor, rename, some class name, and you can see it's changing it in view controller. I want to revisit those weird errors. So what was happening is when you have constraints, Swift will actually convert them into strings, which is kind of weird. But we can leverage these actually. So what I want you to think of is drawing your constraints as straight lines across your screen. And if you can intersect with multiple views relatively, so you're doing like relative to each other, but they're not overlapping, then you can actually write these in one line. So like, for example, if I'm on my desktop and if all my folders are a view, I can draw a straight line through them. That means I can write all of these in one constraint. So how do we do that? First, I'm going to do this simple. So instructors, I'm going to do a horizontal constraint for that. Okay. So instructors is only going to have a leading and a trailing. And actually, this is a little misleading because instructors leading and trailing is going to be 0. But for demonstration purposes. So this actually uses a helper function that I can talk about later, or I'll show later. You can basically just copy and paste it, to be honest. But what it does is it needs a list of views, right? Because this is how you're drawing your line. And you represent your views in the string through this V bracket notation. So you have brackets and then V, and then an index into that list. So if there are multiple views, which we'll see later, it'll be V0, V1, V2. And then we need to show it relative to the super view. So we have vertical brackets to denote the edges of the super view, and then dash integer dash for your padding. And then you just concatenate this into a single string, except we don't need dash 0 dash because it's no padding. So you can just write it like this. So edges of view, right in between is the view. Okay. So if we were to do this vertically, now we have multiple views. We have to do both the instructor label and then the instructor image. But we sadly can't do the gradient background because it goes through the entire thing. So that would have to be a separate call. So first we have to represent our views as strings. So v0 and v1. And you'll notice v0 has this 30 in parentheses. And what that means is we're going to have a height of 30. And the same thing works for width. So the first one has a height of 30. The second one, I don't really know how tall this is. It's going to be dependent on how big the screen is. So I'm just going to leave it ambiguous and let the constraints figure that out for me. And then I need padding in the edges of the screen. And then we just concatenate that into this nice string. So let's do that. OK. So first I'm going to fix background view. And so the function that I'm using is view.add constraints with format. So first I'm going to do my horizontal constraints. So that's denoted by an H and a colon. And then the edges of the super view, and our new view, and background view. And I can just copy and paste this and change this to a V to make it vertical. And that should have a gradient that covers the entire background. Awesome. So now we're going to do that for both title label and instructor view. So since we can't draw them in a straight line because they're vertically aligned, we will have to do 2 of these. Actually, I'm just going to copy this. But we do need padding on these. Technically, we don't need it for the title label, but I'll add it anyways. Actually, I won't. But I will add it for the instructor's view. And we have padding. So I'm just going to insert that, even though it is a little bit gross because it is a static variable. So now we have our horizontal constraints. And I want to add the vertical ones. Actually, I'm going to keep those for now. So view.add constraints. And I'm going to make it vertical. And then I have the edges of the view. Then I'm going to have the first one, which is going to be my title label. And the second one, which is my images. And title label has a height of 30. And then I want padding here, and here, and here. And then I have my list of views, which is going to be title label and instructor's view. And sadly, this isn't as magical as it seems, because this has no idea about your safe area layout guide, which really sucks. But what you can do is we can still clean up like these lines by saying, okay, well, I can still draw a line between the title label and the instructor view. So I can still have this view with its height and the padding in between, and then this view. But I can't really relate it to the super view. So I have to delete these, and then just add them in as I would have before. So I have my title label's top anchor. And then I also have the instructor view's bottom anchor. And hopefully this will be back to where we were before. Awesome. Okay, so I'm just going to clean up my code. Because again, I don't really like having all of this clutter in my view did load. So I'm going to factor this out into a function. So if I select my code and I right click on it, and go back to this handy refactor function, go to extract to method, and then I just name it set up constraints. And it's made a little function for me. I want it to be below, because that's what I like to do. If you'll notice, it has this little file private func tag. File private just means it's only accessible within the file, which can be annoying, except we're not going to be accessing this function outside of this file, so it's totally fine. And now I'm going to organize a little bit. So normally when I'm coding, we have a lot more going on. So I'll have my mini map up, and you'll see, okay, I have a lot of stuff going on, but I don't really have any organization. So what you can do is mark constants, and then you'll see that I have labeled my mini map. So I'll do that again. Mark views, and then view setup. So it shows up in my mini map. It helps other people. You can also do things like add a to-do, which is something I need to do later. I don't know. And you can see that it will show up here. You can also do a fix me, which is a bug, and it will again show up here with a little band-aid. So there's one last topic I want to discuss here, and that's debugging. So you can imagine there's some cases where you don't want to check your preconditions because it'll be really expensive. But you still want to write code so that, you know, if you have a bug, you want to be able to check it quickly. So you want to be able to switch between these modes really quickly. So let's go back to our web scraping again. Let's say I want to debug this. We can do hashtag if debug. You have an else and an end if. You don't need an else. It's optional. And then I can do print fetched image and the URL, or I can print not debugging. And so what's going on here with these hashtags is you're directly talking to the compiler. You're like, okay, if I'm in debugging, I want you to compile this code. And if I'm not, I want you to compile this code. So if I were to type something that was completely invalid, but it wasn't being compiled because it's not the right type, or it's not the right, you know, part of the if statement, it'll actually build. So this is something to be careful of. But okay, let's see if we're debugging or if we're not by default. So shows up in my console, fetched image. So it looks like we actually in Xcode are debugging by default. Now how do you switch that? You go up to this thing, which is your scheme. So you can edit your scheme and you can change it to release. And then if I run this, it says not debugging. But you can imagine there's a lot of potentially sensitive settings here that you don't want people to be touching. So another way to do this is to add a new scheme that's sole purpose is for debugging. So if you noticed, I set the other one to be release. And so I'm creating this new scheme. You can toggle between them through this. I'm going to edit the scheme and make sure that we're on debug. So if I run this scheme, we are debugging. And then if I switch to the original scheme, we're not debugging. And this hashtag also has one other use, at least that I know of, which is if OS is iOS. So you can build apps through Xcode for macOS, iOS, watchOS, whatever. So if you're building the same project for multiple things, you can compile different code for different apps using this if and OS. Okay, so there's one last thing, which is just some action items. You have your midpoint submission due this Sunday. That is all.